Hello, beautiful botanical biohackers, and welcome to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. Today we're joined by neurological wizard, sorceress? What's
Ooh,
the correct?
I like sorceress.
Okay,
Mm.
sorceress, Ayla Wolf, coming out of Stillwater, Minnesota, where she is helping to fix brains. Ooh,
My sister just gave me that.
it's an apothecary shop sign. Very fitting. So every time I talk to you, my mind gets blown. What are you up to these days? What have you been working on?
I've been working on a project, creating a course on the immune system of the brain, because I think that is something that is going to be center stage moving forward into the next 10 years of science and trying to understand why certain people are resistant to treatments for depression, why people suffer from chronic anxiety, possible therapies associated with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, a lot of different neurological conditions. And so I wanted to bring some of the information that I thought was really essential to Chinese medicine practitioners, because I feel that our profession has a lot to offer in the way of Chinese herbs that can do a lot to regulate the microglia and the immune system in the brain.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about microglia and how the immune system works with it?
Yeah, originally, and I remember this because I guess I started. I mean, I started working at a health food store when I was 15, so I feel like I've been studying medicine since I was 15 years old. And I remember, reading that we thought the brain was immune privileged, meaning that because of the blood-brain barrier, the brain was protected from the rest of the body and the peripheral circulation and the peripheral immune system. And therefore, it was almost just assumed that the brain didn't have an immune system because it didn't need one. And now we know that that information is completely untrue. And the brain does have its own immune system. The macrophages of the peripheral system are essentially at like 8 or 9 weeks of gestation in the embryo. These macrophages, a group of them actually kind of break off and migrate into the brain and become the microglia of the brain. So what we know as aspects of our peripheral immune system and white blood cells, we actually have those in the brain. We just call them something different. And when people first started studying microglia, the word glia comes from the word glue. And there were all of these glial cells in the brain that weren't neurons. And so they just called them the glue. They didn't really know what they did. They didn't know what their purpose was. And they just felt like, well, this is just kind of these cells that kind of hold all of it together. So we're just going to call them the glue of the brain. And we now know that they do so many more things than just hold the brain together. That's not what they do at all, actually. And so originally, again, they just kind of wrote these glial cells off as being kind of these cells in the brain that didn't seem as important. Now they know that one of these different types of glia are the microglia. And the microglia, we now know, essentially are the immune cells, the macrophages of the brain. And my best analogy, I used to have a saltwater fish tank, and someday I would like to have one again, because it's so relaxing to me. I'm like all fire, so I need to surround myself with water. And I had a fish tank, and I had sea anemones in the fish tank. And the sea anemones changed shape all the time based on what was going on. And sometimes they would just kind of collapse in and be very still and not doing a whole lot. And then sometimes they would kind of open up, and then sometimes they would get really big and they'd kind of send their tentacles out. And the microglia are the same. So they have different states that they morph into, and they don't necessarily cruise around the whole brain. So certain populations of microglia stay in certain parts of the brain. So there's like a population of microglia that are in the hippocampus, and a population of microglia that live in the substantia nigra. And they essentially kind of anchor themselves like a sea anemone, and they survey the area, and they send out these really long tentacles, and they're looking for any kind of pathogens, anything that doesn't belong. And they're also surveying all of the synapses to make sure that they're healthy. And when we're born with way too many synapses. And part of the development of a baby and a toddler and kids is what they call synaptic pruning, where the synapses that we don't need are pruned away so that the ones that are left are highly efficient, functional, healthy synapses. And it's the microglia's job during that state of development to actually prune all these synapses. And so what they now understand is that when a synapse needs to be pruned, it gets tagged with a component that's called complement. And once a synapse is tagged with complement, the microglia know, okay, now I have to go and gobble up that synapse. That's my cue. That synapse just got tagged. Well, what happens is that much like with autoimmune disorders, where the immune system, when it's functioning, protects us. And when the immune system gets confused and all of a sudden it starts tagging our own tissues as a foreign invader, and it attacks that tissue, well, now we have disease. And essentially what they're understanding is that this same kind of situation is happening in the brain, where in the case of a neurodevelopmental disorder, synapses that should not be tagged are getting tagged. And so now you've got synaptic pruning happening and synapses getting gobbled up in places where they shouldn't be. And in the case of different neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, they're finding the same thing is happening, where synapses that should not be tagged are being tagged and gobbled up. And that's actually, that pathology of the microglial activity is actually happening long before this accumulation of these amyloid plaques that everybody talks about. And so the understanding is that this amyloid plaque might not actually be the origin of Alzheimer's, or it might not be kind of the main pathogenic factor that's driving Alzheimer's. And it might actually be the role of the microglia in destroying all these brain synapses and then leading to all these cognitive symptoms.
Wow, that's amazing. So the plaques, the amyloid plaques, it's kind of like plaques on the teeth. It's not that the plaques on the teeth are causing the tooth decay, it's that there's something else causing the tooth decay, and then the plaques are forming.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then there's this link between so we also realized that we have our lymphatic system, and it was originally thought that the brain doesn't have any kind of lymphatic system itself. And then they discovered what they called the glymphatic system, and they discovered it in rats. And they found very clear evidence that in a rat's brain, they had their own lymphatic system and these kind of aqueducts and this whole drainage system. And so there's been a ton of research looking at, well, does the human brain actually have its own kind of lymphatic flow and connections? And if so, they think that that's what clears out all the metabolic waste and the plaque accumulations. And now they're understanding that there's a big linkage between brainwave states and the activity of this ability to clear debris and toxins out of the brain. And so there's just this like crazy connection between the activity of the microglia in the brain and brainwave states and the ability to actually clear plaque out of the brain. It's all connected.
Wow. And so which states help you to clean up the brain?
Well, there are, so different parts of the brain oscillate at different frequencies. And so we can't really say, oh, the brain should always be oscillating at a certain frequency, or, like they found like theta wave activity is more prevalent in some of the posterior regions of the brain. So it's not so straightforward. It's more about understanding which parts of the brain need to be operating at certain frequencies and what kind of brain states are healthy in the frontal lobe versus parietal lobe versus occipital lobe. So it's not quite so straightforward, but the brainwave states also need to be able to respond to the environment, whether we're awake, whether we're trying to do a cognitive task, or whether we're meditating, or whether we're sleeping. So these brainwave states are always changing. And what they're finding with things like neurofeedback or photobiomodulation is that if you can do some kind of intervention to bring the brainwave states into a healthier function, that creates kind of the shift that can also bring the microglia back into balance and kind of improve this lymphatic activity within the brain and the metabolic clearance. So I think that the next phase of science is really going to be looking at this idea of the electrical activity of the brain, these brainwave states, and how can we create therapies that actually change those brainwave states. And there's also this idea that the neurotransmitters are responding to the brainwave states. And in the case of somebody with depression, for example, it's not about just, here's a neurotransmitter to try to balance out the neurotransmitters. It's this idea of, well, if the brainwave state is not in balance, that's why the neurotransmitters are out of balance. And so we're also kind of finding that there's this other piece here that's been ignored or kind of unappreciated or not recognized until just recently.
It's so fascinating because we know that our heart rate will change our physical function. We know that breathing does that. It's very obvious. But to think that the frequency of the electrical activity in the brain is having physical effects on the body isn't something that we tend to look at the same way. It's like, well, that's mental or psychological. But we're not really thinking of this thing humming at different frequencies that are possibly breaking up amyloid plaque or producing neurotransmitters in different levels, which are affecting our entire circuitry. It's just a difference, I think, in how we look at it culturally, at least for me.
Yeah. And then if you think about how our society has changed to where we're now engaging with everybody through devices, and, how is that having a huge impact on our brain, our brain wave activity? They say that the phones are just like being at a casino and gambling, and you're getting these huge dopamine hits all the time. Mm-hmm. And that as soon as Facebook happened, like all of the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide just skyrocketed in teenagers. And you start to think, well, like, what is the ramification of somebody being on a phone and with all of that electrical activity of the phone day in and day out having on our brains from, the neurotransmitter perspective and an electrical perspective too.
So what would be your suggestion if people, especially teenagers, have been on the phone a lot and their dopamine is getting hijacked in weird belly rubs? What? how do you balance this out with the serotonin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it all comes back to lifestyle. And I feel like people are going down two different pathways. One pathway where people are wanting to merge with technology at an even greater level, like the people that are like, I can't wait for Elon Musk to come out with his Neuralink and I can put this in my brain and all of a sudden I'm a walking computer. There are the people that are totally on board with like becoming in sync with technology and utilizing it to the fullest extent. And then there are the people who are like, I'd rather just live on my farm and grow my own vegetables and not be on Facebook all day. And so I don't want to tell anybody that one way is better than the other. I simply feel like these are diverging pathways and people need to kind of figure out what is good for them. But I would say that for teenagers, that's where I think that giving them a different perspective is helpful. And in a sense, it's like you might tell a teenager, hey, gambling is addictive, or these certain drugs are addictive. And I think they need to also understand the addictive qualities of social media too. So I think certainly we need to have the educational components that people know the dangers of these addictive technologies. I mean, I watch my 9-year-old nephew who is completely addicted to Fortnite. And I mean, there's like, Fortnite is just genius in the way that they sell different like skins that you can put on as the player, and it's like it doesn't give you any kind of advantage over to actually winning the game. It's purely cosmetic.
Uh-huh.
But people are spending, hundreds of dollars on these different skins so they can play the game and look different on the screen. And it's like the amount of just like it's a majorly addictive game. And I'm watching that play out in a 9-year-old kid who would rather do that than hang out with his aunt, right? I'm just take that personally. No, I'm not taking it personally, but it concerns me. It concerns me.
How do you think that's affecting the immune system and then the glial cells as a result?
Well, when you're in a situation where you're spending hours and hours and hours on playing a video game or on your phone, we have to realize that those are hours that aren't being spent doing physical activity. They're hours that are not being spent getting sunlight and being in nature and doing all of the things that we know are healthy for us. So I can't find any health benefits to sitting on the couch, eating junk food and playing Fortnite for 4 hours straight. And so if we think about if we look at it from just purely a time perspective, we only have a 24-hour period in a day, and we know we're probably sleeping for 8 of those hours. So when we start to look at our time commitment to how we delineate how we spend our time, if we're wasting huge amounts of time being on a phone, on social media, playing around with filters and photos and posts, or playing video games, it means that that's time that's not being spent doing things that are actually healthy for us. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's like what now is missing in our lives as a result of putting this much time and energy into these other activities.
Makes sense. So with the glial cells, are there herbs or acupuncture or other methods that you can use to kind of optimize them?
Well, I think yes, there are. And there are specific herbs that I would love to talk about. But before I do that, I haven't spent enough time looking to see if there's research on acupuncture, and I think there's maybe one study I've looked at, so I can talk about that too. But what my hypothesis is that when you do acupuncture, you do change brainwave states. And I'm sure that there is acupuncture out there looking at using qualitative EEG measurements and looking at how the brain wave states change with acupuncture. So my kind of hypothesis is that acupuncture can change brainwave states. As a result of changing those brainwave states, the microglia can possibly change their behavior in response, and there can be a positive neuroprotective benefit. The study that I do have was essentially looking at a Parkinson's model in mice. And after they induced a Parkinson's-like state in the mice, they gave them acupuncture. And then after, there was a group of mice that did not get acupuncture and a group of mice that did. And I believe it was electroacupuncture. And then they watched as these mice kind of degenerated. Sorry, let me back up. So these mice had this Parkinson's-like model. The mice degenerated to the point where they had motor impairment. Once that motor impairment became evident, then they started doing acupuncture on one group of the mice. And then after they did acupuncture, I think it was every single day for 4 weeks, they then redid all the tests looking at motor function, and then they waited to see also what the longevity of the mouse was. And they found that the mice that got acupuncture had improvements in their motor function. And then after they died, they also found that the mice that got acupuncture did end up living longer than the mice that didn't. So there was a bit of a longevity effect as well. And then they dissected their brains, and they found that the amount of what they would call activated microglia were less in the mice that had received acupuncture. And so I've actually seen 2 of those studies. So this is a study that's been repeated, and they use slightly different motor tests. But what's pretty exciting about that study is that it's not just about taking a cell in a petri dish and putting some kind of compound in and seeing what happens to the cell, right? Because with this, they actually saw the degeneration, they saw the loss of motor function, and then they saw that motor function improve. And that's a big difference between just kind of having a hypothesis and mixing a few things in a petri dish and saying, well, we saw something happen. So that's pretty exciting in regards to acupuncture and its potential effects. And then we have a couple of Chinese herbs that have had very specific effects on microglia. And that's really exciting because there are lots and lots of herbs that we know have anti-inflammatory components. But out of our big long list of herbs that are anti-inflammatory, there may actually only be a small percentage of those that do have a specificity to microglia. And so that's what we really need to pay attention to when it comes to neurodegenerative disorders, and even possibly adding some of these herbs to depression that possibly has an inflammatory component to it. And the number one herb is Huang Qin. So Scutellaria bicalensis. And they've essentially determined that it's the flavonoids bicalin and wagonin that have these kind of specific effects on the microglia in terms of inhibiting them. And as I mentioned before, the microglia have different states that they're in. So they have what's called their resting state. It's also called a ramified state or just a surveillance state. And in that state, they're just paying attention to what's going on. And then they have a more of like an amoeba-like state where they can actually have phagocytosis. So if they see some kind of pathogen, they can engulf it and break it down. Or if there's a synapse that got tagged, they can engulf the synapse and break it down. But then there are these other states, and their active state is when they're actually spewing out cytotoxic inflammatory cytokines. So they can spew out INOS, TNF alpha, interleukin 6, interleukin 1 beta, all of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. They also have an anti-inflammatory state where they can spew out anti-inflammatory compounds. So they have these different states that they can take on where they can either be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. And then they have this thing that happens that's called priming, which is, you know, like someone that has a peanut allergy. So if someone has a peanut allergy and they don't know it and they eat peanuts, they have this reaction of the immune system. They possibly go into anaphylactic shock. They get saved, they don't die. Well, from that point forward, their immune system is primed to go into a hyperreactive state the next time they encounter a peanut. And so the immune system is now primed to have this huge reaction if they accidentally eat something that has peanuts in it. And the microglia can have that same thing happen where they can have a situation where they become primed. And so a couple of good examples. One is if somebody has had a concussion, it's normal for the microglia to go through a pro-inflammatory state in the process of healing from the concussion. But then the microglia resolve that and they go back to being their kind of surveillance state. And so, but what happens is that they've now become primed. And so if that person has a second concussion or a third concussion, their immune system is already primed, its microglia are already primed, so that the next time they get a concussion, that inflammatory state might not resolve itself in a normal fashion like it should. And so then the microglia can go on to become hyperactive and continuously spewing out inflammatory cytokines.
Sounds like my brother who played football for too long.
For too long. Yeah, I mean,
repeated concussions, and then it's just, you can tell it takes them a little longer to recover.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's the kind of only pathology that can happen with repeated head trauma, but it's one of them that could possibly happen. And another, because you did that great episode on toxoplasmosis, the research on toxoplasmosis says that if you've had a traumatic brain injury, you can actually be more susceptible to having reactions if you're exposed to toxoplasmosis or Toxoplasma gondii. And so it's the same idea. It's like, if someone is exposed to Toxoplasma gondii, why do they become suicidal? Why do they have crazy depression and road rage and, like basically rage, anger? I mean, and what's happening is that the brain is being hijacked by the microglia because they were already primed, and then they get exposed to Toxoplasma gondii, and now it's essentially the brain is in this chronic inflammatory state, and it's affecting their behavior.
From a traditional standpoint, would you see this as something like liver or heart fire? Is that kind of what you see from a traditional standpoint when you're looking at patients with, not to say that there's a one-to-one overlap, I'm just curious if you've noticed any correlation.
Right. Well, I think that when we look at how Chinese medicine approaches other like autoimmune type conditions, we often talk about either a latent heat or like a yin deficient fire as being part of it. And then within different types of autoimmune conditions, like if we have rheumatoid arthritis, we think, well, maybe this is also more of a damp heat component in the joints. If this is like a thyroid issue, we look at it as more of like a spleen deficiency and a phlegm accumulation. So even within this understanding of like, how do we deal with other immune confusion type situations from a Chinese medicine perspective, where we still have this differential diagnosis that takes place. And I think we need to apply the same strategy with this type of scenario, where if it's somebody that has depression and it's a depression that might be mediated by these microglia, then we would certainly want to use the herbs like Huang Qin. And the other two herbs that I really like when it comes to kind of bringing the microglia back into balance are Bonjourlion, and that's kind of the famous cancer drug. But when you look at its effects, it's also got the same flavonoids, the bicolin, the wagonin, as well as apigenin and luteolin. So these 4 flavonoids are very neuroprotective. And then Juhua also has apigenin and luteolin. And so those are the 3 herbs that from a flavonoid chemical profile have the kind of biggest effect on regulating the microglia and therefore having this neuroprotective effect. So if I had somebody with depression, I would use kind of my go-to formulas like a Xiaoyao San, but I would modify it with those other 3 herbs that I know regulate microglia. Whereas if I had somebody with Parkinson's, I might use more of a classic wind removing formula like Tianma Gotengyin, but I would add those 3 herbs to it. So it's like I'm kind of using my differential diagnosis and then adding in these herbs that have that specific effect on bringing microglia back into balance.
Working with the overall biome of the body first, the pattern-based biome. So you're taking into consideration all of the growing conditions, and then afterwards kind of looking at the details.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. So what kind of effects do you see before and after, or how are you measuring this?
Well, from a neurological perspective, again, if it depends on the condition. So if we're dealing with somebody with Parkinson's, I spent a lot of time doing neurological examinations. And because Parkinson's tends to originate with a degeneration within the midbrain, I look at a lot of vertical eye movements as a kind of cue to how is this midbrain doing in general, because in the midbrain we have 2 different nuclei, the interstitial nucleus of Cajal and the rostral interstitial nucleus of the medial longitudinal fasciculus. And those 2 structures are essentially mediating all vertical eye movements. So whether it's a vertical pursuit or whether it's a vertical saccade where someone's jumping from one point to another in a vertical plane, or if it's a vertical optokinetic type visual stimulus, those are all being mediated by these 2 neural integrators that live in the midbrain. And so, for example, if someone with Parkinson's, I pay extra attention to all these different aspects of vertical eye movements to understand what is the overall integrity of the midbrain. And convergence is also an eye movement that involves the midbrain. So I pay a lot of attention to convergence as well. And so if I see that the thing is if I'm doing acupuncture and Chinese herbs and other kind of brain rehab exercises, it's going to be hard to say what's doing what. But overall, my goal is just to help this person get better. And so what I want to see is improvements in a lot of these vertical eye movements as a cue that at least that part of the brain is having more integrity. And then because the basal ganglia also feeds through a lot of these motor loops, you're paying a lot of attention to different motor functions or motor tests as well. And so I'm looking at, just general motor movements like, the finger tapping or opening and closing the hand or like stomping the foot, looking at aspects of gait. So I use my neurological examinations kind of as my objective biomarkers of, is this patient improving? And if somebody has a lot of cognitive issues, I also pay attention to saccade eye movements in general, because when we move our eyes from point A to point B, like if I wiggle my thumb and the patient is supposed to move their eyes to the thumb as soon as they see it move, we all have a latency, a lag time between the thumb moving and the eyes initiating their movement to that target. And people that have dementia, in a sense, their brain is operating slower. And so they have these increased latencies from when they initiate the eye movement to that target. And so if I start to see that those latencies are improving, that's also going to be a great sign that the integrity of the frontal eye fields in the frontal lobe is improving. And then you can do your memory tests, and have kind of objective data on how well someone performs different aspects of memory testing. So it's like you kind of have to pull in, depending on the situation, you've got to pull in your motor exams and your ocular motor exams and cognitive testing and all of those kinds of things.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. So you're using all of these. What types of neurologic diseases do you find yourself enjoying the most?
I really enjoy working with people with post-concussion syndrome, because that's where I've probably spent the majority of my focus over the last 5 years. I also find that in order to effectively work with those people, it's forced me to understand the emotional component of it and understand, depression, anxiety, the limbic system, how people, how trauma is kind of stored in the brain and the body. So the whole somatic aspect of trauma. And then it's forced me to understand the vestibular component, the autonomic component, the parietal lobe component. And so it's been really helpful, because in the process of learning how to work with people with concussions, I've learned all of this information that then translates over to all of my other patients, because we all have a brain, we all have a nervous system. And so I would say, because I understand a lot of why people with post-concussion syndrome have the symptoms they have, I really also like that educational piece of it, of explaining to people, hey, you're not crazy. There's a real physiological reason for why you're experiencing what you're experiencing, and here's what's going on. And for a lot of people, just having the answers, having the explanation is extremely validating. And that's missing in mainstream medicine, because doctors just don't have the time to kind of sit down and talk neuroscience with their patients and explain what's happening. So I appreciate that I can fill in the gap in that regard. That's rewarding to me. I would say that, I've had good results with Parkinson's patients where they're fairly early on in their diagnosis. I think it's much harder if you've got someone who's in their 90s and they've had Parkinson's for 15 years and you're kind of catching them on say, the tail end of a long-standing neurodegenerative condition. And so I always have to remind myself to, there are some people with neurodegenerative diseases who have very slow progressing diseases. And then there are people that have very fast progressing diseases. And I might even go so far as to say it's possible that in people with really fast progressing neurological conditions, the microglia might be that much more out of regulation and kind of really speeding up the degeneration that's happening. So I think that again, like moving forward in the future here, I think those microglia are going to take center stage in a lot of this research and in understanding why one person with Parkinson's might have a really fast downhill trajectory versus someone else that has a very slow progressive kind of state. And I do think that that's probably in part mediated by just how dysregulated those microglia are. But yeah, I think that if I can, be honest with myself about where someone is in their progress, what all their personal factors are, I think I can usually gauge whether I think I can help that person or not. And if I can, well, then that's super rewarding to see, someone's tremor be there 85% of the day, go down to like 15% of the day, which I've seen with a patient not that long ago.
How many people in the general population would you say have some sort of a brain injury?
I think most children by the age of 5 have probably had like 200 different head traumas. I think we all have obviously banged our heads. We've all fallen off our bicycles. We've all, knocked our heads into something or someone. Most of us have been in car accidents. And the majority of people recover from a concussion and they're just fine. I mean, the research says it's like only 15 to 30% of people go on to have problems. But it's those people that often their lives are altered in major, major ways. But I think that we have to look at it not just from a perspective of, how many head injuries have we accumulated through our lifetime, but if we look at this from more of that microglial perspective of the microglia have been exposed to something, this idea of priming of the microglia. So if somebody had, say, Lyme disease, and then they get a concussion, well, their microglia are probably already primed as a result of the Lyme disease, and then they get a concussion, and now that's a much more serious state. Or, it's like, why are some people with COVID having all these neurological symptoms? Well, it might be that their microglia were already primed. It's like there's, for me, it's not a mystery as to why certain people have different manifestations of different exposures to things. And Scutellaria bicalensis has actually been shown in vitro to prevent the replication of SARS-CoV-2, which is also pretty cool. So it is a potent antiviral. So it has a ton of just immune regulating properties. But I feel like I'm digressing.
What is the life effect when somebody is coming to you and they've had a head injury and they're not all right? How is it affecting them, their family, their ability to work? And what is the process like for them going through treatments with you?
The thing that I've heard the most frequently is people's frustration that on the outside they look normal and that their friends and family and coworkers don't know enough about brain injuries or post-concussion syndrome to be educated. And when somebody looks normal and they're complaining that they're having trouble functioning, they feel like people don't believe them or that they're making up their symptoms. I think that's probably one of the most frustrating things for people is that as they're struggling, the world around them is questioning their sanity and making it seem like they're making it up or they're faking it or they're exaggerating. And so again, most of these people do not feel validated in their experience. And that fuels a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety because then they start to actually believe that they're crazy. So one of the best things that I can do for these people is say, here's the neurological exam findings, and here is what those exam findings are telling me is going on in different parts of your brain, and here's how that correlates to what your symptoms are. And so here's my treatment plan based on your unique presentation of what parts of your brain aren't working so well. We can come up with this tailored treatment plan that can include acupuncture and Chinese herbs and supplements, as well as brain rehab, because I truly feel that in order to rehab a brain, you actually have to put that brain into very certain parameters where you have to exercise certain pathways. And so I think acupuncture, in my mind, it's not, the end all be all of concussion recovery. It's just simply one piece of it that can be really helpful for a certain population of people. So that brain rehabilitation component is really key. And sometimes that takes a team of people to come up with kind of a game plan for somebody.
What is the life effect that you're observing with your patients? So they're coming in, they're thinking they're crazy because people are feeling like they're crazy. They're not sure why. They may be explosive or have trouble focusing to hold down a job. What are some of the after effects of going through an extensive diagnostic and treatment process?
Definitely, I think people, when they realize that there's a actual physiological reason for their symptoms and that they're not crazy, what I see is that people can then allow themselves to have hope that they can actually get better because they have a deeper understanding of what's going on. And so that kind of comes into this whole mind-body connection of, if you start to have more validation in terms of what it is that you're going through, and if you start to feel that you're supported, and you have an actual treatment plan that's tailored to you, what I see is that these people start to move out of the depression and into a more positive framework and into a more hopeful framework and into a more productive way of thinking in terms of, okay, now I have a game plan and I have a path and I have a program, and it makes sense. So the education piece and the having a direction allows people to, like I said, kind of move through this hopelessness that just fuels the depression. And some people really get it and they understand that and they jump on the bandwagon of recovery. And then there are some people that still very much get stuck in kind of a victim state of just feeling like they've had a bad lot in life and there's nothing they can do, and they're not willing to do their exercises. And it's really hard when you have a brain injury, because you become disassociated from your own self, and so I also feel like that's where the acupuncture and the herbs can be helpful in terms of like getting rid of the phlegm that clouds the mind and clouds the personality. And if you can pull that person's personality back out and kind of uncloud the senses, and get them back in touch with who they are, then they can tap back into this more empowered state where they can actually take action.
Amazing. So you have a new clinic set up. How can people contact you or some of your students who are around the world following in your footsteps?
I have two websites. Well, I have three websites. I have my website that's focused on kind of my courses, my education, and that's acupunctureneurology.com. And I'm currently working on a course that addresses the kind of neuroimmunology of the brain. So that should be out hopefully soon, if I don't go too far down the rabbit hole of research. So I have that website. It's had a lot of courses on concussions and concussion management. And then my clinic website is healingresponseneuro.com. And then I have this third kind of project that I'm working on, which is actually an educational project for people, for the public or for patients that have concussions. And that's just going to be more of a video library talking about symptoms and what I'm finding is that because doctors don't have the time to educate their patients, I need to fill in that gap. And it would make much more sense for me to have an educational library of videos addressing different aspects rather than me trying to reach one person at a time. And so this is my attempt to try to reach millions of people all at one time. And people with concussions have a hard time reading and a hard time scrolling on computer screens and dealing with bright lights. So I figured if I could have a video library, it would be easier for them to just watch and listen to videos. And what I'm doing is breaking apart different aspects of, say, dysautonomia, the autonomic nervous system. Like, what can people, how can people start to see the connection between when the autonomic nervous system falls apart, like it's going to lead to all of these symptoms that they're having, from changes in temperature and cold and heat intolerance to changes in heart rate and sweating and dizziness and fatigue and nausea. And so, like, kind of putting all that together for people so they can connect the dots. And then talking about the different types of headaches, talking about why post-traumatic headaches often don't respond to migraine medication and how they often get misdiagnosed as migraines. And so it's like I'm just kind of tackling individual topics and creating just short 10-minute videos.
What's the website on that one? When's it going to be up? I have family members I'm definitely going to send that to. For everybody listening, somebody who has had a head injury, what a great gift to send to them. That would just be a great way to empower them to understand themselves better.
Yeah. Well, it's called lifeafterimpact.org. And the video library is not up yet. I've created a lot of the presentations, and I'm spending the month of September actually recording them. So my goal is by the end of this year to have that library up and running.
Life After Impact.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
.org.
.org.
Yeah, so that was my big project that I've been working on basically all year.
Wow, what a gift. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wolf, for just always, it's not the same material either. You're always onto something new and advancing in a different direction. It's just amazing and such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. You as well. I love listening to your podcast.
See, she's being polite. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. We both love you so much. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Miles, joined today by Dr. Ayla Wolf. Okay. Anything you want to add or that I didn't ask about? I was trying to lead it to kind of call to action.
No, I think that we covered kind of all the different things. I wanted to talk about just the unique kind of behavior of the microglia, the fact that, they're linked to these brainwave states, acupuncture's effect on them, Chinese herbs. So I feel like we covered a lot of the good juicy stuff that I wanted to talk about.
Wow. That was amazing. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I just, I love when the research validates the specificity of our medicine, meaning like there was this really well done study looking at different functional networks in the brain when you needled pericardium 6 as opposed to gallbladder 37. And it was like, oh, sure enough, when you needle, so what they were doing is they were showing people pictures of disgusting things. And the premises being that the pericardium 6 activates the insular cortex, which is related to our internal digestive tract. And that if you showed someone these disgusting images of like rotting foods or dead bodies, that people would have these visceral responses. And so they were curious that if you could needle pericardium 6 and kind of downregulate the insular cortex and the, kind of this like feeling like, oh my God, I feel like puking now that you just showed me this gross, disgusting picture. They were in a sense trying to prove that pericardium 6 regulates this loop between the cerebellum and the insular cortex and the autonomic nervous system. And so their other point that they chose as like the control group was gallbladder 37. And sure enough, they found that gallbladder 37 had absolutely no impact on the insular cortex, but it completely lit up the visual cortex. And yeah, like more so than the control group that didn't get any acupuncture, right? Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense that obviously if you're showing somebody gross, gruesome photos and you're activating the visual cortex, that the visual cortex would be activated. But they showed that by needling gallbladder 37, there was a greater activation between the limbic system and the visual cortex that you didn't see in the group that didn't get any acupuncture.
So it was like turning up their eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just, I find it so fascinating that, we have these cool, very, very high tech modern research methods that are showing, like that there is a specificity between different points, because they also needled pericardium 7. And they found that even the difference between pericardium 6 and 7 was huge. Pericardium 7 lit up the periaqueductal gray in the midbrain, and it didn't light up the insular cortex in the way that pericardium 6 did. And so even a point that's like too soon away, they have different effects. And I find some of these studies so awesome. It's the same thing with this idea that we have this huge laundry list of herbs that are anti-inflammatory, but there's probably only a few key herbs on that list that have a specificity to actually affecting the microglia, with Huang Qin being like your number one.
That's so amazing. It's really, when we're working with old texts, you kind of have to pare them down a little bit. At least I do. I don't take the old ones that seriously until 5 or 6 of them seem to be agreeing with each other. That's kind of the lowest common denominator. But with this more objective testing, it really puts us in a position where it can all truly advance, not just maybe confirm or take that very conservative lowest common denominator approach, which I do. It really sets a platform for where you're going with things, which is, I think it's just incredible.
Well, and I think too, if you look at the 3 Huangs, like that's the Huang of the upper burner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it almost makes more sense that if you take a heat clearing herb for the upper burner, and it turns out that one actually has a greater impact on the microglia that are kind of in the upper burner, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the Huangs that affect the middle burner or the lower burner.
Yeah, absolutely. And Huang Bai has more of an effect as a diuretic, and then Huang Nian is, affecting the heart and gut quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think that, with Da Huang, it has a huge impact on the lipopolysaccharides, so that if there is more of this like gut brain axis dysfunction, to like combine Huang Qin and Da Huang and actually lower the inflammation happening in the gut that could also be triggering inflammation in the brain. Now you've got this whole gut brain axis loop that you're including in your formula. There's just so much there to dive into.
Mm-hmm. So what area of research are you most excited about when it comes to this stuff?
I think that I get I'll get really inspired by certain things. And so right now I got really inspired by this idea that, looking at the microglia, and also how things like photobiomodulation affect the microglia. So there's research looking at gamma light therapy, and gamma light therapy is flickering at 40 hertz. And so if you have a 40 hertz flicker, you create more of this gamma wave activity in the brain that like stimulates the lymphatic aspect of the brain that clears out the plaque. And so they're finding that, this gamma light therapy that flickers at 40 hertz is like specific for getting rid of the plaque accumulations. And I think I get excited about the photobiomodulation, the herbs that can potentially regulate microglia in the brain, and understanding like why the difficult cases are difficult. Like it's always this idea of people. I love the difficult cases. That idea that you've got somebody with a brain injury that's not healing, and then all of a sudden you figure out, oh, well, they have Lyme disease, and maybe they have this, like, their brain is completely inflamed and their nervous system is inflamed, and this is a huge part of why this person went on to have post-concussion syndrome in the first place. Or that idea of, like, me, for example, it's like, yeah, you take somebody with 7 concussions and you throw them on a farm loaded up with Toxoplasma gondii, and it's like, no wonder that person becomes depressed and starts hallucinating and talking to ghosts and like feeling like someone's choking her while she's sleeping and like having all these crazy effects. So I mean, a huge part of it has just been like all the crazy shit that I've gone through and having to figure it out.
Damn. I'm kind of holding my breath for metabolomic studies or tests that I could tell is heat causing damp or damp causing heat, those kind of things
Ah.
to really basically my goal for my life is to destroy the separation between Chinese and Western medicine and just look at it in terms of, I'm actually looking at sniffers, um, like volatile oil, electronic noses, kind of like Star Trek, just sort of scan people and be like, you smell like this microbiota, and to change somebody's stink. And how might that be affecting the rest of their brain, kind of the aerobiome around it? It's still really young, and but anyway, that's where I'm crossing my fingers for, because you can get so good at pulse and you're still not very good at pulse.
Right. Right.
It's just too subjective.
Yeah, and pulse isn't going to tell me, the functionality of the midbrain compared to the parietal lobe compared to the the right frontal lobe versus the left frontal lobe. I'm not that good with pulse.
Mhm.
Don't know if anybody's that good with pulse, but
You
yeah, I
know
agree
what?
with you.
Nobody's that good with pulse. People make a big deal about it, and then I've studied with some of the top doctors in China, and they're incredibly good at pulse. And it's not that it's that reliable. They'll be the first to say it's not that reliable, and then they'll be saying, "Oh, you're pregnant with a boy, and this other thing is going on with you." It seems very specific, but when you're looking at very specific diagnosis in the body, you're going to hit an area of ambiguity. And that's frustrating because sometimes that ambiguity can be the only information needed to change the diagnosis one way or the other, or the strategy one way or the other. A lot of times these, not all the time, but sometimes you get these fringe diagnostics where I
Mhm.
keeps me up, or I'm waking up in the morning going, oh God, did I consider that? Oh no, I did. Just as my brain waves are changing, I'm able to kind of investigate it from different wavelengths, and that ambiguity sucks.
Yeah. And I was listening to an interesting podcast talking about the diagnostics for SIBO and how when you're doing these breath tests, that even the difference between somebody who's having, bowel movements every X amount of hours compared to somebody having bowel movements every Y amount of hours, that is going to affect the meaningfulness of what they're showing on the breath test in terms of SIBO. And so I'm like, even these breath tests for SIBO, it's hard to interpret because you have to know all of these other parameters and how that affects the changes in the levels that they're measuring. And so, yeah, there's a long way to go, but that would be so cool to be able to just like do a nose or a breath thing and be like, oh.
What's going on here? At least, some additional information. I know that there are microbiome tests, stool tests, and that kind of thing. I just, I think scent and breath is going to change much faster than stools as a whole, or,
Yeah. I listened to a lecture on Tibetan urine diagnosis, and I kind of feel like that's what they were getting at with the Tibetan urine diagnosis of actually tasting the urine and learning all about somebody based on how
now,
their urine tasted.
did the doctors do that, or did they have a slave do that who then reported?
Well, it would have had to have been a highly trained slave to
Oh,
pick, kind of like your wine tasters,
so
a
some
urine sommelier.
wow. Well, I mean, I think it's incredible what they can do, but I'm also glad that I don't do it.
Yeah, I'd rather do something else.
Amazing. So, are you back to doing seminars once the COVID goes down, or are you doing mostly online?
I came out with a few new online courses this summer, and then I actually re-recorded my introductory course to concussions just because it was 3 years old and I felt like I could improve the audio visual component and wanted to kind of update some of the research that I talked about. So I worked pretty hard on that. And then I had to teach for AOMA and ACTCM. So I also had to put a lot of time and energy into that this summer, because teaching neurological exam techniques over Zoom is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So I literally had to set up like a video production studio and record myself doing neurological testing. So I'm going to be, this is my last year teaching for the schools. After that, I can't. I don't do well with having to grade papers and deal with academia in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like, when COVID is over, to get back to actually teaching the hands-on neurological examination techniques, because that's the thing people come away from like taking my courses, and that's the piece they don't feel comfortable with, because you really have to be in a room with somebody and practicing it and getting feedback, and just like acupuncture needling, same idea. So that's where I want to focus for 2021 when things get back to normal.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. What about you? How's Hood River treating you?
Well, I've been down a martial arts rabbit hole, kind of looking at the development of modern martial arts as of the mid 1600s, looking at treatises from before then. Back in the day, it was like 4 movements and 2 circles, and this is how you swing a sword at somebody repeatedly in melee combat or in formation. And then after firearms became cheap, then they kind of transitioned more to dueling. And then that's where all of the styles exploded and became more and more complex. Same thing happened in Europe as well. All of these schools of fencing sprang up because in formation, you can kind of stab over the shield, or you're very much more limited. They had treatises from the 1500s from different sword schools, but again, they were based on a few simple motions, because with the sword, you don't have as many options as with the empty hand. So I kind of traced the origins of Mantis back and Tai Chi back to these kind of basic circles and how those relate to the 4 movements of Qi. And I've just been practicing those, and it's been a hell of a lot of fun to deconstruct everything and just kind of start from zero, and then use knife work or like gun and flashlight and having the basic circle. Because a lot of the stuff with Tai Chi, this sort of circular structure, was based on holding a sword or holding sword and shield as this general circular structure. And then, also looking at combat stress and how people will either put their hands up like this when their heart rate gets to a certain point and they lose their fine motor function, or shielding almost like fetal position, and then looking at kind of entering with the guard and then sort of half bind for wrestling and then escaping that again, just using this overall structure in Tai Chi, Bagua, and Mantis. So I've been writing a treatise on that. I know it's really nerdy, but yeah, I've been doing that in order to also understand breath work and the relationship between breath work and movement. And I'm going with that back toward the understanding of the aerobiome and breathing stuff. So that's kind of where I'm going with it. If I plateau or find that I'm getting bored in medicine, if I go more toward martial arts, I tend to, especially with Chinese martial arts that are based on the same kind of ideas, it tends to bring me full circle and bring greater depth into the medicine.
Awesome. I have to say, you did the podcast on breathing for like protection from viruses.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw the title, I was like, you're kidding me. Like, where is he going with this? Like, what the hell? Totally skeptical. And when I listened to it, like, that was like my mind, just like, I could feel my brain just like exploding, because what you were saying was A, stuff I had never heard before, but B, it also made perfect sense. And C, it obviously like pulls in all this ancient breathing practices, which I think is super cool. So I just want to say, like, that's a podcast, and I'm like, I need to like actually sit down and like take notes and listen to this multiple times, because there's so much in there. Like, your podcasts, honestly, it's like you should be charging for them because the information is so valuable.
Well, thank you. I tend to use these really stupid clickbait titles because they work. They do. No, but yeah, oftentimes people will be like, I saw that and I just rolled my eyes. I'm like, I would too. I don't blame you for that.
But at the end of it, it's like I wasn't skeptical at all. I was like, this is really cool. So anyway, I totally appreciate your podcast and your information. And it's like coming from somebody who knows how much work you put into everything you do, like the fact that you have this podcast thing and it's free and people have access to it is amazing.
Well, thank you. And thanks for making it better because, yeah, this is incredible information that really, if you're not doing it, if you decide I'm just going to retire, it's not going to continue in the same direction. I know that you have students and everything, but the way you're approaching it with the passion and just how far you've come already, it's not going to be something that other people can just pick up and follow your line of reasoning and keep going with.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, I'll say that.
Well, I think the similarity is that, you know, when you say you want to completely just abolish the division between like Eastern and Western, that's what I'm trying to do too. And so it's that shared perspective of I'm going to look outside of my own field and see what else is going on in these other areas and then bring it back to what I understand. So it's like I can take the research looking at microglia dysfunction, and then I can go and find some random study that was done in Korea on, you know, Huang Qin and the flavonoids, and that those have specific actions on microglia. And then I can wait 5 years and see that that research has been repeated and that it's been proven over and over again. Because like one of the studies I was referencing was dated from 2020 and another from 2015. So the fact that we've got multiple studies looking at the same thing, finding the same effects, and then repeating that study with not only the herb by itself, but then also the actual flavonoid by itself. So you've got like your herb extract study and then your flavonoid study, and like really isolating which flavonoids are having this kind of effect. And then looking at what other herbs have those same flavonoids. And like, it's just, I think it's that idea of how do you learn, you know, the learning process. And once I learned how to learn, it just unlocks the whole world.
Mm-hmm. And it's fun. I think that it's one of the most fun is being able to bridge that gap. It kind of lights me up for a few days. And when I see other people start to do that too, it's interesting because they'll kind of be following the line of reasoning that I've been using, and then they'll find something themselves, but then they're like, "Is that right?" I'm like, "You tell me." You know? But I think it is really fascinating when we've got more eyes looking in the same direction, and we get, just more perspectives. And then that, what I find really enriching is, if I throw some of the ideas out, people can say, "Oh, well, that's nonsense," which is fine if they have something to back it up, then I'm about to learn. And if they follow the same line of reasoning or just are looking in the same general direction, then I stand to learn a lot as well from that. And then it helps me with where I'm going with it. So I find it's like in the Tao Te Ching, they talk about, releasing to obtain. So that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of, if I can share something with a group of people who are collectively much smarter than I could be at any given day, then there's just so much more that comes back as a result of that. So otherwise I might be stuck somewhere for 3 years, whereas if a bunch of people are kind of looking at it, maybe one person has a different perspective or read a different study, and then they'll say, "Hey, what about this?" So.
Yeah. Well, how is it going with your, so your Peak Tea was your newest formula, right? That's the newest one that you have?
Yeah, there are a few of them. So that was formulated by Jin Zhao, and it's basically wind tea for people with heat. So when I used to use Longdan Xiegan, and he was like, "No, don't use Longdan Xiegan." This is basically his version of Longdan Xiegan for modern people. So it's very good to drain the gallbladder. It has it's Xiao Chai Hu conceptually with Yin Chen and Chai Hu. Yin Chen Hao and Chai Hu. And then there's warm hearth, which is basically just for people who have done the course. Warm hearth is archen arju, and then that's for phlegm. Obviously, it's not good for people with yin deficiency, but it's kind of a transitionary formula that he uses quite a bit when people have phlegm, but then also deficiency. So it's kind of transitioning people over. So personally, I like to use the peak and then warm hearth and combine them. And then if it's kind of makes like a wendan tang idea. For whatever reason, I haven't done that well with wendan tang, and then patients haven't either in the United States. When I use it on skinny Chinese dudes, it works really well.
Interesting.
I've been looking too at the different microbial profiles of Chinese versus Koreans, and then urban versus city people. And so there's an aspect to that that's also requiring a bit of a change. And Jin Zhao is a lot smarter than me, and he's seen 200 people a day who are fairly, I mean, their body shape and temperament and everything, it's pretty American because they're upper middle class Chinese. So their lifestyle and diet and meat consumption, it's really pretty similar to what it is in the US.
So he's kind of using those two as a modified wendan tang.
In that case, yeah. I mean, what I like to do is I watch somebody, or I find some body of information, and I look at, first of all, asking the expert themselves, how can you pare this down simply? And when they're repeating something and they're really good at it, they can already explain it simply because they're experts. So when I first started watching him, it would be like, okay, here's this guy. I can tell his socioeconomic status and body shape. I know he's going to get some kind of variation of Sanren. So I figured that out pretty early. And then it was usually either like wind or peak would be just the initial stage. So in terms of 80-20, those are kind of the majority, because that's how you get through the hard phlegm and damp. And then after that, he spends a shorter period of time transitioning where it's kind of half excess, half deficiency. But it's a shorter period of time. The first bulk of it might be a 2-week period. And then the second part might be a few days to a week. And then the tonification stage, it's like 2 packages of herbs. He's like, here's 2 buchongichi. And after that, eat more shanyao.
Interesting. So it's almost like once he clears the damp and the heat and the phlegm, then the tonification becomes much easier and shorter duration.
Yeah, and I used to take a long time to tonify people. And he told me it's because I was actually not really getting rid of excess. But once you truly get rid of excess, and the people are eating meat more than once a week. So in the Chinese countryside, you really need the da cao in there. You really need to get their blood sugar up, like the Shanghanlun. But with people who have no shortage of access to nutrition, it's mainly just get rid of the excess, because every meal, maybe they have 8 to 10 dishes and they can eat as much as they want. And they have vitamins too. A lot of times they're ordering vitamins from the US. They've got a multivitamin or something they're taking. So it's not really deficiency that's that important. It's actually removing the excess, and then the tonification is so fast.
That makes perfect sense.
For that demographic, I should say. When it's somebody, old or weak, or they're just kind of frail and thin, then you might need to really clear heat, fire, and then nourish yin, a little more Judan Shi style. But based on where he's located, based on his price point, which is much higher than other people, he's basically attracting this similar demographic. And then because of that, you've really controlled for variables. And the more variables you can control for, the easier it is to look amazing.
Right. So at this point, he must feel like his job's a cakewalk.
He does get, so what he told me is that maybe 1 in 100 people are absolutely hard cases, and he gets 2 of those a day. Just something that has his brain going. He's got to really further his study and research, but 99 of them, it's a cakewalk. He's actually just kind of mining for those 2, and then those are the 2 that are going to teach him.
Wow, that's crazy. That's cool.
And the heart of it is just kind of, all right, what do they have that's blocking? Remove that, and then they're basically good.
Mm-hmm. And is he relying mostly on tongue and pulse, or is he doing actual lengthy intakes on 200 people a day?
He does intakes that are about 3 questions.
Okay.
3 to 6 questions max. It'll take him about a minute or two. He has a little bit of a, I don't want to say a baby face, but he has a very innocent, kind face, and he speaks to them incredibly directly. Like, don't waste my time, sit there. And they're already kind of framed. He'll get, like, he doesn't tell them, please sit down. It's just kind of rotated. And then he'll find out some information about them as they're sitting down. Maybe the daughter will say, oh, she's got this, this, and this. He'll just ignore them because they're saying some diagnosis that he doesn't necessarily believe. He'll ask them about thirst, dry mouth. Right away, all he's asking for first is like water metabolism, upper jiao, then middle jiao, then lower jiao. That's it. And the first scan is just, is there damp or latent phlegm? Are they sweating? Do they have normal qi metabolism? If all of those are yes, then let's screen upper, middle, and jiao, lower jiao for blood stasis. Take out the excess damp. If none of those, they're not going to be there, because the basic tonics, Chinese people have it at the grocery store over the counter. So the first thing they're going to do, like all of us, is try to tonify. That's not going to work. So he's already basically been pre-screened, right? Mm-hmm. Because they probably tried over the counter to tonify. So then they come in, he's just looking, all right, it's a strange disease. Otherwise, they're not going to pay this much money. Strange diseases belong to phlegm, blood stasis, fire. So let's first look for phlegm and damp. That's it. That's why he's asking 3 to 6 questions. And then he's going to write out some variation of Sanren Tang, basically like Xiao Chai Hu Sanren Tang as an idea. Give that to them for the first 2 weeks. Then after that, they're going to come back and it'll be like a little bit of blood deficiency. And then maybe he'll just tell them eat shanyao, or here's a tiny variation of Suwu Tang that it's mostly still clearing damp, but then a little bit of blood tonification. And then the end.
That's cool. So basically his questions are, which burner am I dealing with? The extent of phlegm and damp, and the presence of blood stasis.
Yeah. And then after that, and then slowly after that, after clearing those, gently tonifying for a couple days. It'll be like 2 bags of buchong ichi or something like that. I'm like, 2? It's like, yeah. That's going to tonify them? Yeah. Okay.
That's cool. You know, I got into Chinese medicine because of my love of herbal medicine, and I feel like I'm like you, where I kind of just go on these journeys and then eventually make my way back. And like functional neurology was that like giant detour for me, where I got so into the functional neurology that it was like I almost forgot the power of acupuncture. And then I met Clayton, and it's like he brought back my love of acupuncture and the power of acupuncture. And honestly, it was meeting you that made me like really fall back in love with the Chinese herbal piece of it, and start to realize like, hey, I'm not just doing functional neurology. Like, I am a Chinese medicine practitioner, and I've got this acupuncture piece, and I have this Chinese herbal piece. And so it's like, I'm really, I think finally, after this like huge long journey, stepping back into my own shoes and saying like, I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner, and I just happen to have this other piece of information. Like, it doesn't have to be an either or. So it's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you.
Thank you. I've still been recording. Can I take some of the part afterwards and chop it up?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I was like, oh, damn, I'm not going to stop. This is so cool.
Totally.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, anytime, if I can be useful to promote anything you're working on, or just for the hell of it, I'd love to do this.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll keep you posted if I go down any other fun rabbit holes.
Okay, awesome. I'll go out into the sun and do a little kung fu.
That sounds lovely. All right, enjoy.
We'll see you then.
Okay, bye.
Bye.